Okay, everybody. The next speaker is ready. It's Jelmer Borst. He studied artificial intelligence in Groningen, but then stayed there to do a PhD in cognitive neuroscience, where he applied computational models to understand human multitasking. He then moved to Carnegie Mellon University for a while, where he started to work on model-based cognitive neuroscience. Now he is a professor in Groningen, and he will tell us a little bit more about how he applies computational models to human EEG data to understand cognition, the structure of cognition.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, first of all, thanks for inviting me to speak here. So, as you already said, what I do is I try to understand cognition, and I try to understand the link between brain activation and cognition. In fact, I try to understand the link between spiking neurons and cognitive functioning. However, as Kelvin already indicates, the brain is kind of complex, and cognition is also kind of complex. So we have to simplify things to understand what's happening. And therefore, I'm going to present a method that can separate ongoing EEG data into what we call cognitive stages, or at least in meaningful segments that we can then use for further processing. So in general, what I do is I take EEG, MEG, or fMRI data, and then I use that to develop either symbolic cognitive models, so quite high-level models, or really spiking neural models to explain what's going on. And to make that step from neuroimaging data to the models, I use machine learning. And in particular, in this case, or at least in this talk, I'm going to talk about a method that's called hidden semi-Markov model multivariate pattern analysis, which is a bit long. So we first abbreviated it to HSMM MVPA, which is still a bit long. So now we talk about HMP. It's the latest version. But I might use them interchangeably because I've used all of them. Now, and what does this method do? Well, it detects cognitive stages, which is interesting for people who are interested in that. But also what it does, it finds cognitive events in single trials. And I think that can be used for almost anyone who does EEG analyses to do, in a way, more precise analyses than ERPs. As Diego already said in the previous talk, he highlighted how bad ERPs actually are. And I will also have an example of that. And I think we can do much better because we have this very rich data and we should get more out of it than just doing ERPs. Now, I want to explain what I did with an example task so that I can give concrete examples throughout my talk. And the task is associative recognition. Now, what is this? Imagine you had Doritos and Orval yesterday night. And that is possible. You could even have had nacho pizza and Orval, as I know. And if I ask you if you had that, well, the people who were there, they would say, yes, I had this combination. Now, that's very easy, right? You could also have had maybe Doritos and Orval and, well, biscotti and chouf. It's maybe a slightly weird combination, but hey, we're in Belgium. And now I ask you if you had Orval and biscotti. Now you know, okay, I had Orval, I had biscotti, but I didn't have the combination, so you should say no. So this is all about remembering a combination of items that you experienced. Now this is simple. If we have only two combinations, this is what we call a Fan-1 situation, where each item only appears in one pair. But this is much harder if we have multiple combinations. So Doritos and Orval, biscotti and Orval, Doritos and a muffin, chouf and biscotti, and chouf and a muffin. Now I ask you, did you have Orval and a muffin? Now, already just scanning this pattern takes longer, right? And also, if you want to answer this based on memory, we know that this takes longer, that people make more mistakes, and so on. This is what we call a Fan-2 situation, where each item appears in two pairs. Now, unfortunately, we can't use beer in our experiments. At least it's a little harder, and it would also trouble the effects, I think. So what we do is we do word learning, word pairs. In a study phase, participants learn word pairs like comfort mustard, flame cape, metal deck, and so on. Okay. And in the test phase, we then again present word pairs, which can be the same, like comfort mustard is a target. People have to say yes. But also flame deck, which is what we call a repaired foil. So we have the same items, the same words, but now we repair them. And that's difficult because you recognize the words, but you don't recognize the combination. You have to say no. That was the first manipulation, and the second manipulation is that we had an associative fan of 1 or 2, so words appear in either 1 pair or in 2 pairs, and we know that it is more difficult in the fan 2 case. What did we do? Participants saw a fixation cross, they saw the probe, they have to to press a button, they get feedback, and we have an intertrial interval. And what we now want to know is what happens when we show this probe. So they see the stimuli on the screen, and from that moment to the response, we want to know what they were doing. What kind of cognitive stages are they going through? How do they make this decision? To do that, of course, we recorded EEG. I mean, it's an EEG methods symposium. And we use that to figure out what stages they went through. Now, there are theories on this. 3 main theories. Global matching, dual process, and act R. So I display here the time between showing the question and pressing a button. Now, all of these theories assume that people first encode the stimuli, because that's obviously the first thing you have to do, right? You have to see what's on the screen. They also, all 3 assume that you enter the response, because at some point you have to press a button. But what happens in the middle, that varies between those theories. So the first theory, global matching, says, okay, you compare what you see on the screen to all items in memory at the same time. You get one value out of this, you compare it to a threshold, and you say yes or no. That's the only thing you do. Second theory says, no, we need to do more. First, we judge the familiarity of the words. Afterwards, if they were familiar, we retrieve the detailed event where we experienced those items. We compare that to whatever we're seeing on the screen, and then we say yes or no. The final theory, R, says, no, we don't need this familiarity stage. We just directly start with the recollection. We have a short decision stage, and then we have a response. This is basically where we started. We wanted to know which of those 3 was the most likely theory. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to discover cognitive stages. And this is something that people have been doing for a long time. So I don't know if the garden in Nijmegen is here, but one of the first people who did this was Franciscus Donders, right? And you can think about stages like I've just shown you, but you can also think about, for instance, stages of evidence accumulation, where we think about stimulus encoding, then the decision stage, that's the only thing we're really interested in, and the response execution, but also stages in a higher level model. Now, as I said, Donders was kind of the first one who did this. In 1868 already, he introduced the subtractive method. And what he did was really simple. He had 2 tasks that varied only in one single aspect. So for instance, in condition A, you look at a stimulus, and in condition A and in condition B, you look at a stimulus, and you have to press a button. You compare the response times, and the difference in response times is the duration of the new stage. Now, this is problematic because it assumes that you can just introduce a new stage without affecting the existing stages. But still, I mean, this was in 1868, right? This is pretty nice work, actually. Sternberg, 100 years later, in 1969, thought we can do better than this. And he published a paper, The Discovery of Processing Stages, Extension of Donders' Method. And he presented an experimental method to give you evidence of the existence of stages or not. That's the additive factor method. And he discovered stages like stimulus encoding, serial comparison, binary decision, and so on. But already in that paper, he says, yeah, this is limited because we can only show as many stages as we have experimental factors in our experiment, and we don't get duration estimates of those stages. So he already indicated the shortcomings of his method. Now, and therefore, so what kind of links those 2 methods is that they only use reaction times. And they want to use this one reaction time at the end of a trial to maybe discover 6 stages. And of course, that is really difficult to do. We thought, well, we can do better. We can just do brain recordings throughout the trial and use that to find those different stages. So that's why we published a paper in 2016, Discovery of Processing Stages, an extension of Sternberg's method. Go one step further. And we based what we did on 2 theories of ERP generation. Where do those ERPs come from? The first theory, that's called the classical theory, says that every time there is a significant cognitive event, we get a phasic burst of activity in the EEG. So we have ongoing oscillations, something happens, and we get this phasic peak, in this case a negative peak in the gray bar. So these are individual epochs. We do the ERP, the ongoing oscillations will average out to 0, and we get our nice ERP event. It's just very precise, actually, in this example. The synchronized oscillation theory says, no, there is no phasic burst of activity. Instead, the oscillations, the phase of the oscillations reset. But the effect of that is exactly the same. You still get a peak at this moment of the event. So you actually get the same prediction of this to you. So if one of these is correct, and I actually don't care which of them is correct, if we could detect those peaks on single trials, we would know when a significant cognitive event happens. So the only thing we have to do is find those peaks on individual trials. And that's where things get difficult. So you've all been here, right? You have your EEG data. You have all your trials. And now you have to detect those peaks. Well, good luck. This is the point where you maybe should stop. But we thought we can maybe do this. Now, this is my version of Diego's ERPs are bad slide. What I did was I took some synthetic EEG data and I added cognitive events to that. The cognitive events are displayed in orange. So I have 6 peaks in every trial versus a negative one and a positive one, not a positive one, and a big negative one, a positive one. Sorry, there are 5. And I added those to the ongoing oscillations. These are 4 random trials. And as you see, sometimes there's a good correspondence between the cognitive peak and the final signal in blue. But sometimes we get a big peak in our EEG, which has nothing to do with the cognitive events. And we somehow want to detect these orange events. That's also what you want to do when you do ERPs. So if we do ERPs, and I did that here after 5 trials, 20 trials, 50 trials, and 100 trials, in the end, you get something similar to the average of the orange peaks. But that's not that informative, right? Here I have very sharp, short peaks. Here I get kind of a blurry version of this, and especially this last one, where I have actually a really big negative peak in all of my trials. I just get this smeared out version of it. That's just because of temporal variation between the different trials. And that's why ERPs are not great. So what did we do instead? We used hidden Markov models, not surprisingly, and Diego already introduced how this works. And so I'm not going to go in too much detail. But what we do is we take all trials of all participants, so similar to Diego's approach, and from all trials we go from stimulus to response. So we don't do any kind of epoching like you would usually do. We just take the whole time course of each trial and concatenate those. Then we say, okay, so maybe we have 5 events in the data. What the method then does is it tries to find events that explain most of the variance in the EEG data. So in this case, for instance, the second event has a frontal positivity, and that's the average of the second event over all trials. And we assume that those events are the same across all participants and all trials, which is a very strong assumption and which is clearly incorrect, but that's the assumption of the method. What does vary between trials is the duration between the events. So, for instance, here, between the 3rd and the 4th event, the blue lines, and we modeled that with a gamma distribution. So, for instance, here, the second stage has a very peaky distribution because it's very similar across trials and participants. But the 4th one has a very broad distribution because it varies a lot between trials and participants. This is where we were in 2016 when I was at Carnegie Mellon. So this is what I developed with John Anderson and Chong Zhang and Matt Walls. And we were more or less at the stage that Diego was. We had MATLAB scripts, and they were not great. So in the last 2 years, we developed a Python toolbox. So I'm also going to present the toolbox. I guess we're competitors. I guess in the end, we do something similar. Exactly. We should at least compare the outcomes. And I say we, but in fact, Gabriel Weindel, sitting there, did most of the work on this. And this toolbox makes it much easier to use, but it also makes it much more flexible. So originally what we did was we modeled those events as half sine waves of a bit of 50 milliseconds. And that works well. And in the new toolbox, you can just use your own template. And that is nice because you don't believe in 50 millisecond events. Maybe you have a much more specific hypothesis, or maybe you want to do something else than EEG. So maybe you want to look at EMG, where you would expect a different pattern to find, and you can now find different patterns. Also, here we use gamma distributions with a shape of 2, and now we can use any kind of, well, not any kind. We currently have 6 different distributions implemented, and you can choose which one you like best, and that might be based on what the best distribution is to detect events. But it might also be a theoretical consideration, right? You might have a cognitive process which you think should be distributed like a log normal. And then you can test whether that actually explains the data better than if you use another distribution. We're still exploring this. So Gabriel's, as we speak, running an analysis to see, based on synthetic data, which of these recovers the data best. And I think so far it doesn't make such a huge difference. The gamma 2 is very flexible, but it's nice to see if you have a specific expectation, and I'm now thinking about memory retrieval, where you would expect a log logistic distribution, to see if that actually explains your data better. But we're still working on that. Okay, now, this is machine learning, and the big drawback of machine learning is that it always gives you something. I mean, we've seen that with ChatGPT, it just invents references, which is not great. This method can invent events. If I ask for 6 events, I get 6 events. If I ask for 20 events, I get 20 events. So somehow we have to figure out how many events there are actually in our data. So what do? Well, the first thing I do is I take a single event and I shift that over the time course of my data. And because we do expectation maximization, this might end up in a local minima. Actually, that is what continuously happens. And these are those local minima. What I can now do is I can cluster these to see how they are linked to the EEG data. So I cluster based on the log likelihood of the solution, the time, and the EEG topology. If I do that, I get 5. I think, hey, wait, this might be a different one, so I can ask for 6. I get another one. I think that should also be 1. Ask for 7, and I don't get it. I actually get a repetition of that one. Now, this is just to get a feeling for what happens in your data, so how many events there might be across trials. What we then do is we fit a model with very many events. In this case, I have 8. And you can see that some of these are very clear, and others are very weak. Then we take 7 of these, we fit it, and we do that for iteratively. So for each of these we leave out, we take the highest likelihood solution, and for 6 bumps, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now, and already when you look at this, you can see that some of these might be more likely than others, right? So here we constantly have like a copy of an event that seems a bit unlikely. So maybe we have 5 or 4 stages or 5 or 4 events here. So what we then do is we do leave out cross-validation. We fit the model on n-1 subjects and calculate the fit on the left-out subject. And then we see if the fit improves or not. We get something like this. Our likelihood increases. And what I put here in blue are the number of subjects that improve from 1 to 2 stages, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, and so on. So if we go up to 5, we still have 18 out of 20 subjects improving. But if I go from 5 to 6, only 10 out of 20 subjects improve, which means that also the other half actually decrease their likelihood. So I'm pretty sure that I have at least 5 events here. At least that generalize across subjects, because that's what we're looking for here. There are other ways of judging this, but for now we're looking at generalization purposes. So we might go with the 5 event solution. That would be this one. Now the next thing we observe is that this stage, you can't see it here, but we observed it, is that this stage varies across conditions. So if we compared fan 1 and fan 2, we see that there is variability there. So what we then do is we say, okay, what about if what happens if we use a different distribution for the different conditions? That's what I did here. So now I have a different distribution for target fan 1, target fan 2, foil fan 1, and foil fan 2. And well, you see that this stage varies a lot, but the question is this warranted given our data? Can we actually do this? And again, we can do even out cross-validation. So we calculated the fit, and actually this fits the data better for 19 out of 20 participants. So we go with this solution. Now again, what I can do is I can look at this, I can see that, hey, these topologies, they seem kind of different. So I could also allow different topologies between conditions. See what happens. What I did here at the bottom, and you actually see that there is not much difference. And if I do the leave out cross-validation, it turns out this doesn't explain more of the data than that one. Given that it has way more parameters, I would always go with the simpler solution. And that's where my exploration stopped in this case. And you can do this, of course, for every stage, for every topology that you have, to see how complex your model has to be according to your data. Now, in the end, I end up with a final solution like this. I have my reaction time on the x-axis, my 4 conditions on the y-axis, and they are divided into stages. And each stage boundary is characterized by an EEG topology. And if you're interested in cognitive processing, this is the point where you can start interpreting these stages. What do they mean? What happens here? Now, we started out with our 3 theories. So what do you think the first stage is? If you believe our theories and if you think about what's happening in the experiment. Visual processing, right? You see the stimuli on the screen, so you have to figure out what you're seeing. And then, in fact, we thought, okay, the first 2 stages are encoding the words that are on the screen in this case. For instance, comfort mustard. Now, then you can look at the 3rd stage. Again, this is still very consistent across conditions. So this is very, very similar. We thought, okay, this can be a familiarity stage. We also based this on connectivity analysis of what's happening inside the stage, because that's one of the things you can now do. So the question is, have I seen anything like this? If you do, you go on to the 4th stage, and we assume that that is a retrieval stage. You now retrieve the details from what you're seeing from memory, at least the closest thing that you have to whatever is on the screen. So if this is a target, you would retrieve comfort mustard, because you've seen that during your trading session. But if this is a foil, you might retrieve comfort ketchup, who knows, from memory. Then we have a 5th stage, where you compare whatever you retrieve from memory to whatever you're seeing on the screen. If they are the same, this has to be a target. If they are different, this has to be a foil. So you say no. Finally, we have a response stage.
Sort of fundamental question.
Yes.
Is this run on power time series, so just in the raw data?
It's in the raw, well, it's in the PCs of the raw data.
Because like you have this orange state exactly for 300 milliseconds, but I would assume that there is a dominant alpha frequency, for example. That's 10 hertz-ish. But then you will go from peak to trough 10 times per second.
You would have that
20
is
times per second.
yeah.
You have the whole cycle 10 times. Then it's unclear to me how you can have, because in 300 milliseconds you go through peaks and troughs. So the average of that is nil, right?
Yeah. So the question is, what happens to, for instance, ongoing alpha waves, right? Shouldn't you find a new event on every peak and every trough of the alpha wave? I guess that's the question. Well, that would only happen if this is consistent across trials and participants, and if the topology is also consistent across trials and participants. And I think during the cognitive processing, you typically wouldn't see that. Maybe in resting state data, you would.
I think, sorry, so it's a normal XM inference where the state time costs are inferred for every trial.
Yes.
Then next.
Yeah.
But then you have trial number 100. And during that orange time,
well, so you would only get that when it is consistent across participants and trials, and I don't think we find that. Well, let's start. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Can I ask you a different question? So
Yeah.
you have 3 stages at the beginning that seem very consistent.
Yes.
Why not just all 3 are encoding, or all 3 are familiarity, or what? I mean, why label them?
Why label them? Because we are interested in labeling them. That was the original goal.
But if your question is there a familiarity signal or not, then you calling that 3rd thing a familiarity seems you imposing your theory on the data.
Sure. So we should base this on the data, right?
Yeah.
What our label is. And so things we look at are topologies, are effects of different conditions. So for instance, in one of the experiments we had not only those 4 conditions, but also a condition where there were new stimuli, where you see that actually jump from the 3rd stage directly to response. You can look at connectivity in the different stages, see if you can link that to cognitive processes. So this is...
So it's based on more knowledge than you're showing here.
Yeah, this is the very quick and dirty version of interpreting this. But that's important, right? How you interpret this. And yeah, so this is the one side of the method where we interpret those things. But I think the other side is that we can improve on standard EEG analysis, and I will show that next.
Maybe more basic question, but I didn't follow why the topologies are linked to the boundary of the event and not to the process itself. So why are they boundaries?
So I think that's the big difference. Let me just stay. That's the big difference with Diego's method, is that we try to find events in the data. And the assumption is that this event, so this peak in the data, is the start of a cognitive process, according to the theories. So we're not trying to find consistent pieces of consistent activation in time, and I think that's more what Diego is doing. It's what we used to do for fMRI data, where that worked well, but for EEG data we had less success.
Is that responding to my question?
Maybe it is, yeah.
Because you are looking at the topography at that endpoint.
Exactly.
Because the topography, if you average across half a second,
then it's 0. Yeah, no, so I was, okay. So
is consistent or not across.
Yeah. Okay, maybe that's the answer. Yeah, so this is the interpretation that we wanted to do at kind of when we set out with this analysis. But the other thing that's interesting, and we only realized that later, is that you actually get a single trial estimate for the event. So that's what I display here. We have, this is one trial, and for in this case, 5 different events, doesn't matter. We get a probability distribution of when it happens during the trial. And what you can now do is you can say, okay, what about we use these as new events in our trials? And we can do event-related potentials, but not based on stimulus or response, but on the events that we detect consistently across trials. If I go back to my example of ERPs, I now add a third column where I do what I call peak-related potentials. I take the moments that were detected by the analysis, and for every trial, I either stretch them a little bit or shrink them to the average length of that stage. Then I do the averaging, and now you can see that already after 5 trials, I have a very clear pattern, and after 100 trials, I get these very sharp peaks back. Now, it's nice if this works in synthetic data. We can also do this in real data. So this is a paper from one of my PhD students where we have a standard ERP, which is pretty nice, broadens out a little bit at the end. And if we do this peak-related potential, we get very sharp peaks in our data. And especially I like the last one here, which was very broad. Normally what happens when you go away further from stimulus. But here it turns out that it's actually quite peaky for all of our conditions. And now we can look at the difference in time between those 2 events in our data. Now here I'm stretching and shrinking the data. People might not like that because, well, I'm messing with my data. What you can also do is just do an ERP on one of the events to see what happens, like a classical ERP, except that you take a different point of reference. So these are kind of the default outcomes of the method. And what I now want to do is I want to go over a couple of other things we did just to give you a feeling for what we can do with this. So the first thing you can do is you can go back to Donders. You can look at stage insertion, right? So these are 2 different mathematical tasks. One where I think you just had to read a number and you had to press a button, and one where you have to do a substitution and a calculation, and then you have to press a button. And what you can see is that the first 2 stages look the same, the last looks the same, but now we get an insertion of 2 extra stages in this process. This would be one way of judging what's happening in the conditions and what different stages are. Because if they appear in very simple conditions, they are probably basic processes. They only appear in the more difficult conditions, and it has something to do in this case with the calculations. This is also what we saw yesterday, or for the people who were here yesterday in tutorial 3 and 4, where in the accurate condition, we saw an extra stage appearing compared to a speeded condition. So there was an extra process going on. Now, one of the things we wanted to do was connect this to cognitive models. And what we did, for instance, was we assumed that every event was linked to the firing of a production rule. In case you're familiar with XR, that tells you something. But with, I would say, a spike of activity in the basal ganglia that changes the processing in the brain. We then build a model that implements those processes, and then you can also look at the stages of the model, and you can compare the stage of your model to whatever stages you detected in the data. And that's a very nice way, I think, of evaluating cognitive models, because often they are so complex that it's very hard to say whether this is a good model or bad model. And this way we get at least a better grip on what's happening. Now, as I said, we have those time points. So what we can also do is time frequency analysis, but now in the stages across trials. So you get a much more precise comparison between trials. I think this is linked to what Diego told us about decoding, where you take the same stages to do the decoding on, you get much higher decoding quality. Here you could also do decoding based on stage that the participants are in. We didn't do this yet, but I think it would be interesting to see if you then also get better decoding outcomes. We can do MEG. It's very straightforward, but now we can look at stage localization. So for instance, if we have an encoding stage, in this case, we did that across 2 different tasks, we get clear occipital activation, which is what you would expect. You can look at the moment of the event, but you can also look throughout the whole stage, what's happening, to better interpret what's going on in the stages. And again, that's an answer about how we figure out what's going on. Well, in this case, we can look at the brain activation in more detail. Also in MEG, what we've done is we have actually applied the method to back-projected MEG data on the cortex. So we first calculated source activation, we applied the method, and then we did connectivity analysis within those sources. And again, that gives you a very nice description of your data, and you can use that for interpretation. Now, something I think at least one person in your audience is interested in is evidence accumulation. So evidence accumulation models try to separate your processing into 3 stages and then describe the decision stage. Problem is, what happens when you have more than 3 stages, right? In complex tasks, this is really difficult. And then typically what happens is that all the other stages are mapped onto non-decision time, whatever that is. What we can now do is we can fit the evidence accumulation models to one of those stages, and we did that. And actually what you see is that the non-decision time disappears. So you have a much more precise estimate of your model. And moreover, what you can also do is you can take multiple decisions in one task and then separate the task in those decisions and analyze each of these decisions with an evidence accumulation model. You can look at continuous predictors. This is something one of my PhD students currently is looking on. He looked at word recognition. So this is an lexical division task. You have to say whether something is a word or not. He looked at the frequency of the words, both of words and non-words. He used Google frequencies for that. So you type in a word on Google, you get a frequency, and you use that as the frequency also for non-words, which works surprisingly well to explain things. Now, for instance, in one of the stages, we see that there's a clear difference between stimulus categories, but we also see that, for instance, for the red category, we have a decrease in stage duration with Google frequency. We now look at stage 1. We actually see that most of the conditions have an increase in stage duration with frequency. In this way, we can tease out those overall effects on RT, but attribute them to different stages. We've also done one task where we actually had opposing effects in 2 stages. There was no effect on RT of condition, but you could see that one stage became shorter and one stage became longer. In this way, again, you can just separate your RTs into smaller units and interpret those. Now, and in the end, this is all up to you, right? You get those time points per trial and you can do something with it. You can think about clinical populations. Maybe they do something different. Maybe they have extra stages, fewer stages. You can think about strategies. So when you learn a new mathematical operator, first you have to do all the calculations. And at some point you start having memory retrievals, which are much faster and should be a different stage. And you can track those things with this method. But in the end, this is really up to you what you want to do with the results of the analyses. So what can we conclude? Well, I think this is a powerful method to investigate processing stages. Then, if you don't believe in those labels that I put on the stages, which I can imagine, I do think it gives you new analysis possibilities due to those in-trial events. And for that, it's also less important to detect the exact right number of events. You can just say, okay, I take the most prominent one, and I use that to separate my trials into 2 different parts and do the, for instance, ERPs on this one event in the middle. And I think this is something we should still investigate further. It also allows for longer trials with MEG and EEG, because in general, you're kind of limited to maybe 1 second, right? If you do ERPs, because after that, the effects just wash out. But here you can take maybe 3, 4, 5 second trials. Of course, the analysis takes time because we take all data of all participants into the analysis at once, which can be quite kind of heavy on the processing, but you can do it. And I think that opens up new possibilities. Now, as I said, I also wanted to advertise a toolbox, the HMP package, which is on GitHub. You can download it. There is a tutorial, and then you can play with it. If you find bugs or have questions, just send us an email, and we'll have a look at it. Now, I would like to thank some of the people I work with, the people at Carnegie Mellon. my PhD students in Groningen who did a lot of the analysis, and currently I'm working on this with Gabriel Weindel and Leendert van Manen in Utrecht on a grant of the US Air Force to develop the toolbox and, well, to finally now also apply the toolbox to data, because that's the stage where we're at, and that's what we actually want to be doing. And thank you very much for listening to me.
Do you assume that the events all have a similar magnitude of the ERP that they generate, or can they be very small, very big? And
they can be different. So what we assume so far is that they have the same shape. And then then it's a multivariate pattern across the electrodes. So some electrodes can be positive, some can be negative, as long as it is consistent across trials. The amplitude can differ.
Like some could be very local, some could be very distributed over the scope.
That's possible. Yeah. Well, I would say the distributed one is easier to detect.
Yeah, that was my point.
I'm afraid.
You're biased to certain type of ERPs, events, as opposed to others.
I think you're biased based on the amplitude,
yeah.
Because the higher the amplitude, the more likely is it stands out from the oscillations.
Yeah.
And you're biased perhaps by the shape. I'm not sure of that. So in the original paper, what we did was we varied shapes to see how well it could recover events in synthetic data, and it turned out the 50 millisecond width worked well for different widths of the actual events. But it might be that different ERPs have different shapes. I wouldn't really expect that, but that could happen.
And it's up and down, or is up and down and down and up?
No, it's just up and down right now.
No, it has to be monophasic.
Yeah, right now it is, but you can use a different template.
Yeah. Thanks.
Other questions? All the way in the back.
I have a question regarding if you have like a condition with like two same events, let's say, do you have a meaningful way to compare these events if there is difference between them? Because that can have like the same length in time, same topography, but maybe like an amplitude or something that's different.
Yes.
There is a way to compare.
Yeah, so the question is if you find two similar events between conditions, if you can compare them somehow. Well, you can, because what you get in the end is just a time point per trial, right? So you can actually do whatever normal analysis you would do on two segments of your EEG data. So if you want, you can do t-tests, you can do decoding, you can do permutation tests, whatever you normally would do, except that you now take the time points that the analysis method gives you.
I'm wondering, is your method like based on the assumption of like this strict serial process?
Very good question. Yes.
Because here you assume basically one stage end and then the other stage start, right? So is it possible also to account for like the overlapping stages?
Yeah, so the question is whether we just assume strong seriality between the stages, or whether we can also get overlapping stages. So in fact, what we detect are the onsets of stages, because that's what happens at such an event. There should be a new stage of processing. But we don't detect the offset. So it can very well be that one stage continues while the other stage starts. And that is somewhat tricky, because I now talk about stage durations, but actually I shouldn't be talking about those, because I'm only looking at stage onsets. Now in a simple psychology experiment, we typically do get those serial stages, I think. But if you make things more difficult, I mean, maybe just do a PRP task where you have two parallel tasks, you would expect parallel stages, but that's much harder. We also, in this case, assume a strong serial HMM. So we cannot revisit stage that we've been in before. But what you can do, of course, is you can just discover similar events, because that is not constrained. And what you could then do is test whether the fit of your data is better if you actually use exactly the same brain topology, for instance. There was a question there, yeah.
It was already answered actually, but I was wondering if there is a way of tracking like the variance explained by topography. So if maybe one topography explains more variance in one state of the other, or since it's only regression, there is no way of going back to that data. So there's only the offset.
I guess what you could do is just leave. So the question is whether we can track how much variance each of the events explains. What you could do is you could remove one of the events, see how the likelihood changes. But the method might then, maybe without re-estimation, this should work. Not sure. Looking at my postdoc. So I think you could leave out one of the events and then track the likelihood change. That's what I would do. Yeah. And there was a question, Michael?
So why do you fit all the data from all participants in one model?
Yes.
Do you, for instance, fit, because I'd be interested in looking at individual differences. So could I just use the technique fit one participant, then maybe do cluster analysis on the topographies?
Yeah, so the question is, why do we analyze all subjects at the same time? We want more data. That's the short answer. So when we started this, we really needed quite a lot of data. It seems to work now with less data, but still it's nice to have, say, at least 5 participants or so. What we would like to do is to build an hierarchical model. So where we have a standard Bayesian hierarchical model where you have the parameters of the participants depend on the overall parameters. But again, as Diego also said, this is not easy. So that's one of the next steps that we want to do, because it will be very nice. So what you can currently do is you can just take out the stage durations per participant or the topologies per participant and compare those, but they are still based on one overall model. So you can do that, but I don't really trust it that much. But in the end, it's just a matter of having as much data as possible.
Online. Nathan? They're asking, why did you decide for LDA in order to separate your high-dimensional data into one-dimensional subspace? Makes the assumption that variance matters, but other assumptions could be interesting too, like statistical independence, contrast between conditions, etc. Could you comment on that? Also, make sure you can see it.
No, I can't see it, but
Okay.
so I don't think I talked about LDA. So I think it's a question to a different talk.
Rest to Jelmer. Hi from Nijmegen.
Okay.
Jelmer. But then there's also another question asking how you think this could be transferred to the analysis of oscillatory states.
And he says, sorry,
means PCA.
PCA. So we did PCA first, just to reduce the computational complexity. So you can do this on raw EEG data, but well, the analysis takes longer. So that's why we first did PCA, and then we typically select the top so many components that explain, say, 95% of the variance or 99% of the variance. So that's why we do PCA first. I don't remember the rest of the question. Sorry.
Okay, yeah. I will just repeat the entire question. So, the question was, why did you decide for PCA to separate your high-dimensional data into one-dimensional subspace? Where are you working right now? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It makes the assumption that variance matters, but other assumptions could be interesting too, like statistical independence, contrast between conditions, etc. Can you please comment? Yeah, so I said this was just based on computational complexity. I think we didn't really think about what it would imply for the rest of the analysis. But it's an interesting question. As I said, we have also done this on raw EEG data, so I would have to think about this for more. And are there more questions? How do you think could this possibly be transferred to the analysis of oscillatory states? So you cannot, I think you cannot use it to detect oscillatory stage, but what you could do now is you can take the stages that we detect and then do time frequency analyses within those stages, and then perhaps find stronger effects perhaps. That's something, well, we have only done this for connectivity analyses, and that works well. Sure.
I was from Michael's question, because I think I asked this to Gabriel last time, but I can't remember, because I think I did actually during Matza. I think what he's getting at is, like, if you did an ICA or something instead of PCA or other decompositions, is it potentially better?
I don't know. It's the short version. Gabriel, do you have an idea for this?
You will have to repeat that on the mic.
Yeah, sure.
The main thing is that PCA is the most agnostic. If you use ICA, then you already start to subselect stuff that you want to see in analysis. That's why we don't like it. But it's an open question. Maybe there are other ways, other decompositions that could be helpful. But again, this is mainly for computational perspectives because it does take up memory and time. But we can always rely on the raw data again to have some doubts on what the information did.
Yes.
I would disagree that ICA reduces.
No, ICA is perfectly fine. It's just that if you select some events in the ICA, then this would probably be the one you will get in the end. Or you might not want to do this pre-selection on yourself, but let the data speak.
So PCA is problematic on HMM estimations for reasons that we can talk, technical reasons. So ICA is just a rotation of PCA that bypasses these issues. But you have exactly the same information. Because to do ICA, you do first PCA. So you have the same information, it's just a rotation of that. That solves a lot of problems. So I would say ICA thumbs up. It's a weird job.
Yeah.
Okay.
A technical question. So when you do the trial-based events, do you randomly select the trial, or do you do something else to make sure you select the normal trial?
So the question is, if you do trial-based events, if you look at those, do you select trials, or do you just take random trials? We just take all trials, because for every trial you get those estimations, and so we just take all trials into account as you would in any standard EEG analysis. In that case, then of course you can average within participant and across participants and so on.
Only to take the correct trials?
Oh, sure. So, so the question is, shouldn't you only take correct trials? So before we do this analysis, all the standard EEG pre-processing steps can be done, right? You want to clean your data, and you might want to only take correct trials into account if you think that in your error trial something weird happens, like your participants weren't paying attention. You want to throw them out. If you want to analyze what the difference is between correct and incorrect trials, and you know that your participants were paying attention, then you want to keep your incorrect trials in the analysis, and you can see if there may be different stages. Of course, then you need a substantial amount of error trials if you want to do that. But this really just depends on your experimental question, what you do with that. So in that case, you do a trial selection, but based on the behavior, not based on the EEG. More questions?
I'm not sure you saw my talk on Monday, but I showed some data that when you have already encoded visual information to work in memory, you have time to kind of associate specific actions with these visual representations. That actually, by the time one of these representations become relevant, you can select the visual information and the action plan in parallel. So breaking with this intuition of a serial stages, because in fact you had to work during delay to kind of put things into place for going parallel. And so it'd be quite interesting data set to check what would happen with your method, because if it's parallel selection, maybe that will be classified as one event, then it's a visual and a motor event. Or would it try to still separate them into two different events? What will happen?
So yeah, so the question is, if you have a data set where things happen in parallel, in this case a visual and I guess a motor event, if they happen at exactly the same moment in all trials, this would become one event. If there is variability across trials, this might be separated into two events. But that depends how close they are. It would be interesting to try out. Yeah.
We have this data set and we publish them and stuff. So
sure.
Oh, let's talk.
We should talk. Nice. Great.
Yeah, there is one more follow-up.
Yeah, I think it was like related to the discussion that you had about the.
I just said that to the most recent.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, this is related to the PCA discussion.
Yeah, I think we mostly covered that. If you have more questions, just email me. Maybe that's easier than this conversation.
He has one more comment. He has longitudinal ERP data.
I think yours is faster than
Apparently they are not in sync.
Okay, it says, I have longitudinal ERP data, patients train a task over 30 hours, which for sure has changes over time that would be worth tracking.
Yeah, so what happens when you have longitudinal data and things change over time? I think that's a very interesting question. So one thing we have done is looking at training. So again, going back to the mathematical operations, at some point you switch strategies to solve them. And what we then did was we detected those strategies switch based on behavioral data, and then we fitted separate models to those segments that we separated on based on behavioral data. But of course, what you could do is you could fit models block by block, or maybe day by day, or hour by hour, and see if they change, if events disappear, if stage length changes, if you have enough data. That's the big requirement here.
Are there any more questions from here? All right, thank you very much, Jelmer.
Thank you all for your questions.
And yeah.